On the 15th day of August, in the year 797, the bronze doors of the imperial palace in Constantinople closed with a sound that did not echo, but settled. Inside, beneath ceilings lined with gold mosaics and saints staring down in silent judgment, a young emperor was seized by men who had once sworn to die for him. By nightfall, Constantine VI, ruler of the Byzantine Empire, would never see again. Beyond the palace walls, the city breathed as it always had. Ships drifted across the Bosphorus, their sails catching the last light of a summer evening. Merchants counted coins beneath striped awnings. Priests lifted incense in churches older than memory. The empire appeared unchanged, its rituals intact, its order preserved. Yet within the marble corridors of power, something irreversible had taken place, carried out not by a foreign enemy or a rebellious general, but by the will of a mother. She had come from Athens, not as a conqueror, but as a bride. Irene, born into a lesser noble family, entered Constantinople as an ornament to imperial continuity, chosen for her beauty and her silence. Over the years she learned the language of the court, the weight of ceremony, and the uses of patience. When her husband died in the year 780, she did not retreat into shadow. She stepped forward, first as regent, then as something far more unsettling. In a world where power passed from father to son, she broke the chain with deliberate hands. Faith itself bent to her authority, and when the moment came, she chose the throne over blood, and the empire over mercy, leaving behind a reign marked not only by golden doctrine, but by an act that would define her name for centuries. In the year 754, Constantinople stood as the wealthiest city in the known world, its walls stretching across land and sea like a declaration of permanence. Triple fortifications of stone and brick rose in layers, each one thick enough to withstand siege engines and time itself. Within them, the imperial capital shimmered with domes plated in gold leaf, their surfaces catching the sun and casting light across the Bosphorus. It was a city built not only to endure, but to impress, to dominate, and to remind every visitor that this was the center of an empire that had outlived Rome itself. At its heart stood the great palace, a sprawling complex of halls, courtyards, and private chambers overlooking the Marmara Sea. Floors were inlaid with porphyry and green Thessalian marble, polished to a mirror finish that reflected torchlight in restless patterns. Walls were covered in mosaics depicting emperors crowned by Christ, saints frozen in solemn authority, and victories rendered eternal in glass and gold. The air itself carried the scent of incense and wax, a mixture that clung to silk robes and whispered through every corridor. Here, power was not simply exercised. It was staged, rehearsed, and performed with precision. The Byzantine emperor did not rule as a mere sovereign, but as God's appointed representative on earth, a figure both political and sacred. Every gesture, from the way he entered a hall to the order in which officials approached him, followed a script refined over centuries. Foreign envoys recorded the mechanical lions that roared beside the throne, and the gilded birds that sang from artificial trees, devices designed to overwhelm and unsettle. Wealth was displayed not discreetly, but overwhelmingly, as a language of authority understood across cultures. In Constantinople, spectacle was governance, and illusion was as valuable as steel. Yet beneath this choreography of control lay a system constantly threatened by its own structure. Succession was rarely smooth, and bloodlines offered no guarantee of safety. Emperors were crowned in triumph and deposed in silence, often within the same lifetime. Blinding, exile, and assassination were not aberrations, but accepted tools of political correction, methods that removed rivals while preserving a veneer of divine order. The throne stood at the center of everything, but it was never secure. In the century before Irene's arrival, the empire had been reshaped by crisis and adaptation. Arab armies had pressed against its eastern borders, seizing vast territories and forcing Constantinople to defend itself with both strategy and innovation. The introduction of Greek fire, a weapon that burned even upon water, allowed the imperial navy to repel sieges that might otherwise have ended the empire. At the same time, internal reforms reorganized land and military obligations into themes, binding soldiers to territory and tightening imperial control. Survival had come at a cost, and that cost was constant vigilance. Religion, too, became a battleground, not only between Christianity and its external rivals, but within the empire itself. The question of icons, whether sacred images should be venerated or destroyed, divided court, clergy, and population. Emperors such as Leo III and Constantine V enforced iconoclasm with severity, ordering the removal and destruction of religious images across the empire. Monasteries resisted, often quietly, preserving icons in hidden chapels and private collections. What appeared as a theological dispute was, in practice, a struggle over authority, loyalty, and the limits of imperial power. By the middle of the 8th century, the imperial court had become a place where belief and ambition intertwined with dangerous intimacy. Marriages were arranged not for affection, but for stability, alliance, and the production of heirs. Women who entered the palace did so under scrutiny. Their influence depended on their ability to navigate a world that offered them visibility without security. Some faded into ceremonial roles, their names recorded only in passing. Others learned to listen, to wait, and to act when the structure around them showed its fractures. The empire's wealth remained vast, drawn from trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to Asia and beyond. Silks, spices, and precious metals flowed through Constantinople's harbors, taxed and regulated with careful precision. The solidus, the gold coin of the empire, maintained its value with remarkable consistency, trusted from Baghdad to Rome. Yet even this economic strength could not insulate the throne from instability. Money sustained the empire, but it could not guarantee loyalty. It was into this world, balanced between ritual and violence, that Irene of Athens would arrive. She would enter not as a conqueror or a reformer, but as a bride selected to serve a purpose defined by others. The palace would receive her with ceremony, its gates opening to admit another figure into its intricate hierarchy. Within those walls, she would observe, adapt, and wait until the moment when the machinery of empire aligned with her own will. In the year 768, in a city far from the ceremonial gravity of Constantinople, Irene was born into a provincial aristocratic family in Athens. The city, once the intellectual heart of the ancient world, had long since faded into a quieter existence under Byzantine rule. Its marble temples still stood, weathered and repurposed, their columns casting long shadows over narrow streets filled with traders and craftsmen. Irene's lineage connected her to the local elite, but it was a status measured in influence rather than proximity to imperial power. Her family, the Saranta Pichos, held land and modest authority, enough to secure recognition, but not prominence. They operated within a network of regional loyalties, navigating the expectations of imperial administration while maintaining their own local interests. Irene grew up in an environment where survival depended on adaptability, where alliances shifted quietly and ambition was rarely declared aloud. From an early age, she would have understood that visibility could be both opportunity and risk. Little is recorded of her childhood, but the absence of detail reflects the broader reality of women's lives in the Byzantine provinces. Education for girls of her standing likely included religious instruction, basic literacy, and the management of household affairs. Yet even within these constraints, observation became a form of preparation, a way of understanding how authority functioned in both public and private spaces. The lessons were subtle, but they were constant, shaping a temperament suited to patience and calculation. In Constantinople, far beyond the hills of Attica, a decision was being prepared that would alter the course of her life. Emperor Constantine V, determined to secure the succession, sought a suitable bride for his son, Leo IV. The process was not left to chance, but organized with deliberate structure, drawing candidates from across the empire's noble families. This so-called bride show assembled young women in the capital, where their appearance, lineage, and demeanor would be evaluated under imperial scrutiny. The journey from Athens to Constantinople covered hundreds of miles, crossing sea and land in stages that exposed the scale of the empire Irene was about to enter. Ships carried her across the Aegean, their wooden hulls creaking under the weight of cargo and expectation. Upon arrival, the city rose before her in layers of stone and gold, its walls dwarfing anything she had known. The transition was immediate and absolute, from provincial familiarity to the controlled spectacle of imperial life. Within the palace, the selection process unfolded with ritualized precision. Candidates were presented in carefully arranged settings, their movements observed, their speech measured, their presence assessed against the expectations of the court. Beauty mattered, but so did composure, obedience, and the ability to embody imperial dignity. Irene, still in her teens, distinguished herself within this environment, not through extravagance, but through restraint. In the year 769, she was chosen as the bride of Leo IV, heir to the Byzantine throne. The marriage was formalized with ceremony, binding her to a dynasty defined by both power and volatility. She received the title of Augusta, marking her entry into the highest rank of imperial womanhood. With that title came visibility, influence, and the constant awareness that her position depended entirely on the stability of those around her. Leo IV, known as Leo the Khazar due to his maternal lineage, ruled as co-emperor before ascending fully upon his father's death in the year 775. His reign continued the policies of iconoclasm, maintaining the prohibition against religious images that had defined his father's rule. Irene's personal beliefs, shaped by a different environment, did not align with this doctrine, but within the palace, disagreement required discretion. Silence became her shield, allowing her to observe without confrontation. The imperial court operated through layers of hierarchy, each role defined by protocol and proximity to the emperor. Eunuchs managed access, generals commanded armies, and clergy negotiated the boundaries between spiritual and political authority. Irene moved within this structure carefully, building relationships that extended beyond formal titles. Influence, in this environment, was rarely declared openly, but accumulated through presence, memory, and timing. In the year 771, Irene gave birth to a son, Constantine VI, securing her position within the dynasty. The child represented continuity, a living link between past and future, and his existence elevated Irene's standing within the court. As mother to the heir, her role expanded beyond ceremony into something more substantial, though still constrained by expectation. The palace, with all its grandeur, remained a place where security was temporary and loyalty conditional. Leo's reign was marked by tension, both external and internal, as the empire continued to navigate military threats and religious division. His health, never robust, declined over time, introducing uncertainty into the question of succession. Irene, now established within the inner circle of power, observed these developments with increasing clarity. The structures that had once seemed immovable revealed their vulnerabilities, and within those vulnerabilities, opportunity began to take shape. When Leo IV died in the year 780, the balance shifted abruptly. Constantine VI was only 9 years old, too young to rule independently, and the empire required a regent. Irene, positioned by both circumstance and preparation, stepped into that role with immediate authority. The transition was swift, but not uncontested, and within the palace, the first movements of a longer struggle had already begun. By the time Irene entered the imperial court, the Byzantine Empire had already spent decades consumed by a conflict that reached far beyond theology. The question of icons, whether images of Christ and the saints could be venerated, had become a dividing line that cut through every layer of society. It shaped alliances within the palace, determined the fate of monasteries, and influenced loyalty in the army. What began as doctrine had hardened into policy, and policy into enforcement backed by imperial authority. The origins of iconoclasm stretched back to the reign of Leo III, who in the year 726 issued edicts against the use of religious images. His motivations were complex, shaped by military pressures, theological interpretations, and the desire to assert control over a fragmented empire. Some argued that the veneration of icons bordered on idolatry, while others saw their destruction as an attack on tradition itself. The debate, once confined to scholars and clergy, became a matter of law, enforced through confiscation and punishment. Under Constantine V, the policy intensified into a systematic campaign. In the year 754, the Council of Heir formalized iconoclasm as official doctrine, declaring the use of images in worship to be heretical. Monasteries that resisted faced closure, their wealth seized, and their inhabitants dispersed or punished. The imperial government extended its reach into religious life with unprecedented force, transforming belief into a matter of compliance. Those who opposed the policy often did so quietly, preserving icons in hidden spaces, aware that discovery could lead to exile or worse. The effects of these measures were visible across the empire, from the capital to its most distant provinces. Churches once filled with painted figures were stripped to bare walls or replaced with simple crosses. Artisans who had specialized in iconography found their crafts suddenly forbidden, their skills rendered suspect. The visual language of Byzantine Christianity, developed over centuries, was interrupted by decree. Yet the memory of these images persisted, carried in private devotion and collective resistance. Within the palace, the issue of icons was not merely theological, but deeply political. Support for iconoclasm often aligned with loyalty to the reigning emperor, while opposition could signal dissent. Eunuchs, bishops, and generals each navigated the question carefully, aware that a misstep could alter their position. Public conformity did not always reflect private belief, creating an atmosphere where silence carried meaning. It was in this environment that Irene began to form her own stance. Raised outside the immediate influence of the iconoclast court, Irene's personal convictions differed from those of her husband and his predecessors. She had grown up in a context where the veneration of images remained part of religious life, embedded in daily practice rather than debated in councils. Upon entering the palace, she encountered a system that demanded not only outward compliance, but internal alignment. Instead of open resistance, she chose discretion, allowing her beliefs to remain largely unspoken. This restraint did not go unnoticed, but it allowed her to move within the court without immediate opposition. She cultivated relationships with individuals who shared her views, including members of the clergy who had quietly maintained their support for icons. These connections were not formal alliances, but networks of mutual understanding, built over time. In a court where every position could shift, such networks provided stability that official titles could not guarantee. The death of Leo IV in the year 780 created an opening that extended beyond questions of governance. As regent for her young son, Irene inherited not only political authority, but the responsibility to navigate the empire's religious divisions. The policies of iconoclasm remained in place, supported by factions within the military and administration. Any attempt to alter them would require careful planning, as well as the ability to manage the reaction of those invested in their continuation. Irene's early actions as regent suggested a measured approach, rather than immediate confrontation. She retained key officials to maintain continuity, avoiding abrupt changes that might provoke resistance. At the same time, she began to reposition figures within the church, appointing individuals more sympathetic to the veneration of icons. These decisions, subtle in appearance, signaled a shift in direction without openly declaring it. The empire, meanwhile, continued to face external pressures that demanded attention and resources. Military campaigns required coordination and funding, while diplomatic relations needed constant management. In this context, religious policy could not be separated from broader governance, as each decision influenced stability. Irene understood that any transformation of doctrine would need to align with the empire's capacity to absorb change. As the years progressed, the question of icons moved closer to the center of her rule. The divisions it represented were not fading, but deepening, as generations had now grown up under conflicting practices. Irene's position allowed her to influence the outcome, but it also placed her at the intersection of competing expectations. What had once been a matter of personal belief was becoming a defining element of her authority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would extend beyond theology into the structure of power itself. Irene's ability to navigate this conflict would determine not only the direction of the church, but the stability of her regency. Within the palace, decisions were being prepared that would reshape the empire's identity, and with it, the balance between tradition and control. On the 8th day of September in the year 780, Emperor Leo IV died within the walls of the great palace, leaving behind a throne occupied by a child. His son, Constantine VI, was 9 years old, too young to command armies or control the factions that surrounded him. The transition of power, though immediate in ceremony, created a vacuum in practice. Into that space stepped Irene, no longer simply the emperor's widow, but the regent of the Byzantine Empire. The proclamation of Constantine as emperor followed established ritual, conducted in the Hagia Sophia, beneath its vast dome of gold mosaics. Clergy in layered vestments moved through incense-filled air, their chants echoing against marble surfaces worn smooth by centuries of procession. The child stood at the center, crowned and displayed as the continuation of imperial order. Yet the true authority rested elsewhere, in the decisions made behind the scenes, where Irene began to assert control with deliberate precision. Regency in Byzantium was not a passive role, nor was it universally accepted. Military leaders, senior officials, and members of the imperial family all held interests that could challenge her position. Some viewed a female regent as a temporary necessity, others as an opportunity to advance their own influence. Irene understood that legitimacy would not be granted by title alone, but secured through action and alignment. Her first measures focused on stabilizing the court, maintaining continuity where possible while identifying potential threats. She retained key administrators who had served under Leo, ensuring that the machinery of government continued to function without disruption. At the same time, she began to elevate individuals whose loyalty was tied directly to her authority. Among these were eunuchs, figures uniquely positioned within the court, barred from founding dynasties of their own, and therefore dependent on imperial favor. Through such appointments, Irene constructed a network that operated within the existing hierarchy while subtly reshaping it. The army presented a more complex challenge, its commanders accustomed to direct loyalty to the emperor rather than his regent. Several generals questioned the extent of Irene's authority, viewing her position as provisional. In response, she moved carefully, avoiding open confrontation while reinforcing her role through official channels. Orders were issued in the name of Constantine, but their content reflected her decisions, binding the appearance of continuity to the reality of control. Within the palace, the atmosphere shifted as factions recalibrated their positions. Courtiers who had once aligned themselves with Leo sought to secure favor with the new regency, offering support in exchange for influence. Others remained cautious, observing Irene's actions before committing themselves. The balance of power was not static, but constantly negotiated through gestures, appointments, and silence. In this environment, patience became as valuable as decisiveness. Religious policy, long a source of division, remained unresolved at the outset of her regency. Irene did not immediately reverse the iconoclast measures of her predecessors, recognizing the potential for backlash among the military and certain segments of the clergy. Instead, she adopted a gradual approach, allowing space for discussion while quietly repositioning key figures within the church. This strategy allowed her to build support without provoking immediate resistance. Her relationship with her son, though outwardly defined by maternal authority, carried political implications that extended beyond the household. Constantine was both her child and the symbolic center of the empire, a figure whose future independence could alter the balance of power. Irene oversaw his education and public appearances, shaping how he was perceived by the court and the population. At the same time, she ensured that access to him remained controlled, limiting the influence of those who might seek to guide him independently. External pressures continued to test the stability of her rule, as the empire faced ongoing threats along its borders. Military campaigns required coordination and resources, demanding decisions that could affect both reputation and control. Irene delegated responsibilities to trusted officials, maintaining oversight while avoiding overextension. Success in these efforts reinforced her authority, demonstrating that governance could continue effectively under her regency. Financial management also played a critical role in sustaining her position, as the empire's revenues supported both administration and defense. Tax collection remained consistent, and expenditures were carefully monitored to prevent strain on the treasury. Irene understood that economic stability underpinned political stability, providing the means to reward loyalty and maintain order. In this, as in other areas, her approach combined continuity with subtle adjustment. As the years passed, her regency became less provisional in practice, even as it remained defined by her son's minority. Constantine grew older, and with that growth came expectations of independent rule. Those who had supported Irene began to consider how their positions might change once he assumed full authority. The question of succession, once resolved in ceremony, began to re-emerge as a matter of timing and control. By the middle of the decade, Irene had established herself as the central figure in the governance of the empire, her authority recognized both within the palace and beyond its walls. Yet this position contained within it the seeds of future conflict, as the transition from regency to independent rule approached. The structures she had built, designed to secure her power, would soon be tested by the very figure they were meant to protect. In the year 786, Irene moved from quiet preparation to decisive action, turning her attention fully toward the question that had divided the empire for decades. The restoration of icons could not be achieved through informal influence alone, but required formal validation at the highest level of ecclesiastical authority. To accomplish this, she called for an ecumenical council, a gathering that would define doctrine, and by extension, reinforce her legitimacy as regent. The location was set for Constantinople, within reach of the palace and under the shadow of imperial control. Preparations unfolded with care, as bishops and representatives from across the empire were summoned to attend. The Hagia Sophia, with its immense dome and echoing galleries, stood ready to host proceedings that would shape the religious future of Byzantium. Clergy arrived bearing texts, arguments, and the weight of long-standing divisions, each aware that the outcome would carry consequences beyond theology. Irene's role remained formally supportive, yet her influence guided the composition and direction of the assembly. On the first day of August in the year 786, the council convened, its opening marked by ceremony and expectation. However, the proceedings were abruptly disrupted by opposition from within the imperial army, particularly units loyal to iconoclast doctrine. Soldiers entered the city, their presence a direct challenge to the authority behind the council, and the gathering dissolved before it could establish its purpose. The message was clear, as resistance to change remained strong and organized. Irene's response was calculated rather than immediate, avoiding confrontation while preparing a more secure approach. She reorganized military units within the capital, removing those most likely to oppose her plans and replacing them with forces loyal to her authority. This restructuring extended beyond the army, as she adjusted positions within the administration to ensure alignment across multiple levels. The failure of the First Council did not halt her efforts, but refined them. In the following year, she called for a second attempt, this time relocating the council to the city of Nicaea, across the Bosphorus from Constantinople. The choice of location provided both symbolic and practical advantages, distancing the assembly from immediate military interference while connecting it to earlier traditions of church councils. Nicaea, with its fortified walls and quieter atmosphere, offered a controlled environment where deliberation could proceed without disruption. The stage was set once more, but under conditions shaped by previous experience. On the 24th day of September in the year 787, the council opened in Nicaea, bringing together bishops, abbots, and imperial representatives. Over the course of several sessions, arguments were presented, texts examined, and positions articulated with formal precision. The debate centered not only on theology, but on the authority to define it, as the relationship between emperor and church remained central. Irene's representatives ensured that proceedings moved toward a conclusion aligned with her objectives. The outcome of the council marked a decisive shift in imperial policy. The veneration of icons was restored, with careful distinction made between worship, reserved for God alone, and reverence, which could be directed toward images. This formulation allowed the reintroduction of icons without contradicting core theological principles, providing a framework acceptable to a broad range of participants. The decrees were formalized, recorded, and prepared for implementation across the empire. The restoration of icons extended beyond doctrine into the visual and cultural life of Byzantium. Churches began to reinstate images that had been removed or destroyed, commissioning new works to replace those lost. Artisans returned to their craft, producing mosaics and paintings that reintroduced familiar forms into sacred spaces. The visual language of the empire, interrupted for decades, resumed with renewed intensity, reflecting both continuity and change. For Irene, the council achieved multiple objectives, reinforcing her authority while aligning the empire's religious policy with her personal convictions. By orchestrating the process through formal channels, she presented the outcome as a collective decision rather than an imposed directive. This approach reduced the potential for immediate backlash, even as it altered long-standing practices. Her position as regent gained strength, supported by both ecclesiastical endorsement and administrative control. Yet the resolution was not absolute, as opposition to icons did not disappear with a single decree. Elements within the military and certain regions of the empire continued to resist, their loyalty shaped by previous policies and beliefs. Irene's challenge shifted from establishing doctrine to enforcing it, a task that required ongoing attention and adaptation. The balance she had achieved remained subject to pressure, both from within and beyond the court. Within the palace, the success of the council elevated Irene's standing, but also altered perceptions of her role. No longer seen solely as a caretaker of her son's throne, she emerged as an active shaper of imperial direction. This transformation influenced how others positioned themselves in relation to her, recalibrating alliances and expectations. The structures of power, once adjusted, rarely returned to their previous form. As Constantine VI approached maturity, the implications of Irene's actions became increasingly significant. The authority she had consolidated, both political and religious, would inevitably intersect with his claim to independent rule. The restoration of icons had strengthened her position, but it also set the stage for a future in which control could not be shared indefinitely. The decisions made at Nicaea would echo beyond doctrine, shaping the conflict that was already beginning to take form. By the year 790, Constantine VI had reached an age where ceremony alone could no longer define his role. He was no longer the child who stood beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia guided by others, but a young emperor expected to command, decide, and rule. The empire, accustomed to Irene's steady regency, now faced the question of transition. Authority, once concentrated in a single hand, began to divide along lines that were both personal and political. Constantine's education had been carefully managed, shaped within the confines of the palace and under the supervision of those loyal to his mother. He had been taught the language of rulership, the protocols of court, and the expectations of command, yet his exposure to independent decision-making remained limited. This imbalance became increasingly visible as he sought to assert himself. Those around him began to notice the contrast between imperial title and practical experience. Within the court, factions emerged with greater clarity, aligning themselves either with the young emperor or with the established authority of Irene. Some saw in Constantine an opportunity for renewed influence, a ruler who might be guided or persuaded. Others remained committed to Irene, whose governance had provided stability and whose networks remained intact. The palace, once unified under regency, now operated with a dual center of gravity. In the year 790, a group of military leaders and officials initiated a move to elevate Constantine's authority, attempting to free him from his mother's control. Their efforts culminated in a brief shift of power, during which Irene was temporarily sidelined. However, the attempt lacked the cohesion and support necessary to sustain itself, and Irene moved quickly to reassert her position. The episode revealed both the presence of opposition and the limits of its organization. Following this challenge, Irene took steps to secure her authority more firmly, addressing those who had supported the shift in power. Some were removed from their positions, others reassigned to roles with reduced influence. The process was conducted with measured precision, avoiding overt displays of retribution while ensuring that the balance of power returned in her favor. The message, though subtle, was understood across the court. Constantine, now aware of the dynamics surrounding him, began to assert his independence more directly. He sought to engage with military commanders, to establish relationships beyond the immediate reach of his mother's influence. These efforts met with mixed success, as his position remained constrained by the structures Irene had built. Each attempt at autonomy exposed the limitations imposed upon him. The relationship between mother and son grew increasingly strained, shaped by competing expectations and incompatible roles. Irene viewed her authority as necessary for the stability of the empire, while Constantine saw it as an obstacle to his rightful position. Their interactions, once defined by hierarchy and care, became marked by tension and calculation. Within the palace, even routine exchanges carried political weight. Public perception began to shift as well, reflecting the uncertainty within the court. Some segments of the population expressed support for Constantine, viewing his independent rule as a natural progression. Others remained aligned with Irene, whose leadership had guided the empire through years of transition. The division, though not always visible, influenced how authority was interpreted and accepted. Religious policy, though stabilized by the Council of Nicaea, continued to intersect with these tensions. Constantine's stance on icons did not carry the same personal investment as his mother's, yet it remained a factor in how he was perceived by different groups. Clergy who had supported Irene observed his actions closely, while those previously aligned with iconoclasm considered the possibility of change. The issue, though formally resolved, retained its capacity to influence allegiance. Military affairs further complicated the situation, as campaigns along the empire's borders required clear and decisive leadership. Constantine sought to take a more active role in these efforts, aiming to establish credibility through action. Successes and failures alike were measured not only in territorial terms, but in their impact on his authority. Each outcome contributed to the evolving perception of his capability as a ruler. By the early years of the decade, the coexistence of regent and emperor had become increasingly untenable. The structures that had once allowed Irene to govern effectively now constrained Constantine's ability to rule independently. At the same time, his attempts to assert control threatened the stability she had worked to maintain. The balance, delicate from the beginning, showed signs of fracture. As tensions intensified, the court moved closer to a decisive moment, where accommodation would give way to confrontation. The question was no longer whether Constantine would rule, but how that transition would occur, and at what cost. Within the palace, where power had always been negotiated through both ceremony and force, the next phase of conflict was already taking shape. In the year 788, as Constantine VI moved further into adulthood, his personal life became inseparable from the politics of the empire. His marriage, arranged years earlier under the supervision of Irene, had been intended to reinforce stability and continuity. Maria of Amnia, chosen through a formal bride selection, entered the palace as empress with the expectation of obedience and discretion. Their union, however, failed to produce the cohesion that had been carefully planned. The marriage produced 2 daughters but no male heir, a fact that carried significant weight within the imperial system. In a court where succession defined security, the absence of a son introduced uncertainty into Constantine's future. Beyond this, the relationship itself deteriorated, marked by distance and dissatisfaction. The emperor began to look beyond the boundaries of his arranged union, setting in motion a chain of events that would destabilize his position. By the year 795, Constantine took the decisive step of divorcing Maria, sending her to a monastery where she would live in enforced seclusion. Such an action, though not without precedent, required careful justification within both legal and religious frameworks. The official grounds cited were insufficient to satisfy many within the Church, who viewed the decision as a violation of established norms. The emperor's authority allowed the act, but it did not secure acceptance. Shortly after, Constantine married Theodote, a woman from within the court who had served as one of Irene's attendants. The union, conducted with imperial approval, was seen by many as both impulsive and improper. Theodote's elevation from court official to empress disrupted expectations, blurring the boundaries between hierarchy and personal desire. What might have remained a private matter instead became a public controversy. The reaction from the clergy was immediate and divided, with some bishops refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the second marriage. Monks, particularly those committed to strict interpretations of canon law, spoke openly against the emperor's actions. Among them, figures such as Theodore of the Studium emerged as vocal critics, framing the issue as a moral and religious integrity. The dispute, soon known as the Moechian controversy, extended far beyond the palace walls. Irene, observing these developments, maintained a position of calculated distance while allowing the consequences to unfold. The controversy weakened Constantine's standing among key religious groups, many of whom had previously supported the restoration of icons under her regency. Without directly opposing her son, she benefited from the erosion of his authority. The court, attentive to shifts in influence, began to adjust its alignments accordingly. Within the military, dissatisfaction also grew, though for different reasons. Constantine's leadership in campaigns had produced mixed results, failing to establish the decisive authority he sought. Generals who had once supported his independence began to question his judgment, particularly as internal conflicts distracted from external threats. The cohesion of the army, essential to imperial stability, showed signs of strain. The combination of personal scandal and political uncertainty created an environment ripe for unrest. In several regions, resistance to Constantine's rule began to take shape, expressed through both passive disobedience and active opposition. Local officials hesitated in their enforcement of imperial directives, while others openly aligned themselves with alternative centers of influence. The emperor's authority, though still intact in form, weakened in practice. Irene's position, by contrast, appeared increasingly stable, reinforced by her established networks and measured approach to governance. She did not need to challenge Constantine directly, as the consequences of his actions created openings she could occupy. Support from segments of the clergy and administration shifted subtly in her favor, strengthening her influence without overt confrontation. The balance of power, once contested, began to tilt. Within the palace, tensions intensified as trust between mother and son eroded further. Advisors and officials navigated a landscape where allegiance carried risk, choosing their positions with increasing caution. Conversations that had once been routine became strategic, each word weighed for its implications. The unity of the imperial household fractured under the pressure of competing ambitions. By the year 796, the situation had reached a point where resolution through compromise seemed increasingly unlikely. Constantine's efforts to assert control were undermined by the consequences of his own decisions, while Irene's influence continued to expand. The structures that had once supported shared authority now reinforced division. The empire, governed from within a single palace, operated as though it contained two competing courts. As the scandal of the emperor's marriage continued to resonate across the empire, its effects extended beyond reputation into the mechanics of power. What had begun as a personal decision had become a catalyst for broader instability, reshaping alliances and expectations. Within this shifting landscape, Irene prepared for a decisive moment. one that would determine not only her future, but the fate of the throne itself. By the year 796, the balance of power within the Byzantine court had shifted in ways that were not immediately visible, yet deeply consequential. Irene no longer needed to confront her son directly, as the structures around him began to respond more readily to her authority than to his commands. Influence moved quietly through corridors, carried in sealed messages, private conversations, and carefully arranged appointments. What appeared outwardly as continuity concealed a deliberate reorganization of power. The process began with the gradual removal of Constantine's most loyal supporters from positions of influence. Military officers who had aligned themselves with the emperor were reassigned to distant commands, separating them from the center of decision-making. Others were replaced entirely, their roles filled by individuals whose loyalty to Irene had been tested and confirmed. These changes were executed without public declaration, framed as routine adjustments within the administration. Within the palace, access became the most valuable currency, and Irene controlled it with increasing precision. Audiences with the emperor were filtered through officials who answered to her, shaping who could speak and what could be said. Information, once flowing more freely, now moved through channels she supervised, allowing her to anticipate and redirect developments before they reached a critical point. Constantine, though still emperor in title, found himself increasingly isolated within his own court. The imperial guard, a force traditionally tied to the person of the emperor, also underwent subtle transformation. Units were rotated, commanders reassigned, and loyalties tested through a series of small but significant decisions. Irene ensured that those responsible for the security of the palace were aligned with her interests, creating a protective barrier that extended beyond physical defense. The presence of armed men remained constant, but their allegiance had shifted. Financial administration provided another avenue for consolidating control, as the treasury underpinned both governance and military operations. Officials responsible for revenue collection and distribution were replaced or brought into closer alignment with Irene's network. Payments to key figures were managed carefully, reinforcing loyalty through consistency and reward. The empire's wealth, once a shared resource of authority, became a tool directed by her hand. Constantine attempted to respond, seeking to reassert his authority through direct action and renewed alliances. He reached out to remaining supporters within the military and administration, attempting to rebuild a base of power independent of his mother's influence. These efforts, however, were undermined by the structural changes already in place. Each initiative encountered resistance not through open defiance, but through delay, redirection, and quiet obstruction. The court adapted to this new reality with a mixture of caution and calculation. Officials learned to interpret subtle signals, aligning themselves with the prevailing direction of authority. Public declarations of loyalty to Constantine continued, maintaining the appearance of unity, while private actions increasingly reflected Irene's dominance. The duality of power, once balanced, now leaned decisively toward one side. Religious figures, many of whom had supported Irene during the restoration of icons, reinforced her position through their continued alignment. Their influence extended beyond doctrine into public perception, shaping how authority was understood among the population. Sermons, correspondence, and ecclesiastical decisions all contributed to a narrative that emphasized stability under her guidance. Constantine's standing, already weakened, found little reinforcement from these quarters. By the early months of the year 797, the transformation was nearly complete. The mechanisms of governance, from military command to administrative control, responded primarily to Irene's direction. Constantine retained his title, but the substance of his authority had diminished to a symbolic presence. The empire, though still functioning, had effectively shifted its center of power. The final stage required no public proclamation, only the alignment of existing elements into a single decisive movement. Those positioned within the palace understood their roles, having been placed there through years of preparation. Communication was minimal, relying on established trust rather than explicit instruction. The absence of visible tension masked the imminence of action. On the eve of that action, Constantinople continued its routine, unaware of the precise moment approaching within the palace walls. Markets opened, ships docked, and prayers were offered as they had been the day before. The city, accustomed to the rhythms of imperial life, gave no sign of the shift about to occur. Within the great palace, however, the final arrangements had already been made. The transition from shared authority to singular rule would not unfold as a dramatic confrontation, but as a controlled execution of decisions long prepared. Irene had reshaped the court without spectacle, ensuring that when the moment arrived, resistance would be minimal and coordination complete. The empire stood at the edge of an event that would redefine its leadership, carried out not through open conflict, but through the quiet certainty of a plan fulfilled. On the 15th day of August in the year 797, the great palace of Constantinople awoke to a morning that carried no outward sign of disruption. Light moved across the marble courtyards, illuminating columns and mosaics as it had every day before. Servants followed their routines, officials prepared their documents, and the machinery of the court advanced with practiced precision. Within this ordered environment, the final act of Irene's consolidation of power was set into motion. Constantine VI remained within the palace, his position already diminished by months of isolation and quiet displacement. His access to allies had been reduced, his movements increasingly observed, and his authority limited to formal appearances. Those assigned to his service had been carefully selected, their loyalty aligned not with the emperor, but with the structure surrounding him. By this point, resistance had little space in which to form. The operation unfolded without public announcement, relying on coordination established over years rather than sudden force. Officials moved through corridors with purpose, delivering instructions that required no explanation to those receiving them. Guards took up positions that appeared routine, their presence neither unusual nor alarming to those within the palace. The absence of visible tension allowed the process to proceed without interruption. At the appointed moment, Constantine was seized within his chambers by men acting under imperial authority. The action was swift, controlled, and conducted within the enclosed spaces of the palace, away from the eyes of the city. There was no public confrontation, no assembly of troops in the streets, only the execution of a decision already secured by prior arrangements. The emperor, once the center of power, was now its subject. He was taken to a chamber within the palace complex, a room defined by its function rather than its decoration. The walls, like many within the great palace, were constructed of stone and lined with surfaces that reflected little sound. Here, the act that would define Irene's rule was carried out with deliberate precision. Constantine VI was blinded, a method long used within Byzantine politics to render a ruler incapable of governing. The choice of blinding was not incidental, but rooted in the logic of imperial succession and control. A blind emperor could no longer lead armies, preside over ceremonies, or fulfill the visible requirements of rulership. The act removed him from contention without formally ending his life, preserving a framework that maintained continuity while eliminating challenge. It was both a political solution and a calculated statement of authority. Reports from the time suggest that the procedure was severe, leaving Constantine permanently incapacitated and possibly leading to his death shortly afterward. The exact details remain uncertain, but the outcome was clear in its effect. The emperor, who had once stood at the center of the empire, was no longer a participant in its governance. His removal was complete, both in function and in perception. Within the palace, the transition that followed was immediate and controlled. Irene assumed sole authority, her position no longer defined by regency, but by direct rule. Official communications were issued in her name, and the structures of administration adjusted to reflect the new reality. The empire, accustomed to continuity, adapted quickly to the shift in leadership. Beyond the palace walls, the news spread through Constantinople with measured pace, carried by officials, clergy, and rumor alike. The reaction was complex, shaped by existing loyalties and the absence of visible upheaval. There was no widespread uprising, no immediate challenge to the new order, only a gradual recognition that power had changed hands. The city continued its routines, even as the identity of its ruler had been fundamentally altered. The act itself, however, carried implications that extended beyond immediate governance. The blinding of a reigning emperor by his own mother introduced a precedent that could not be easily absorbed into existing narratives of authority. It demonstrated that the bonds of family, often invoked to legitimize power, could be subordinated entirely to its preservation. The throne, as it had always been, remained an object of both continuity and rupture. Irene's rule, now unshared, rested upon the success of this moment, secured through preparation rather than open conflict. The court, already aligned with her authority, adjusted without resistance, reinforcing the stability she had constructed. The empire, vast and complex, continued to function under her direction, its systems responding to the commands issued from the palace. The transition, though decisive, appeared seamless in its execution. In the spaces where Constantine had once moved freely, silence settled with a different weight, marking the absence of a figure who had been both emperor and son. The corridors, unchanged in structure, now reflected a new arrangement of power, one defined by a single will. On that day in August, within walls built to contain both ceremony and secrecy, the Byzantine Empire passed fully into the hands of Irene of Athens. In the months following the events of August in the year 797, Irene ruled the Byzantine Empire without a co-emperor, an arrangement unprecedented in its clarity. She did not present herself merely as regent or guardian of a dynasty, but as the sole holder of imperial authority. Official documents and seals bore her name alone, without reference to a male counterpart. In the language of power, the distinction was unmistakable. Her titles reflected this shift with deliberate precision, as she adopted forms traditionally reserved for male rulers. In some records, she was styled not as empress, but as emperor, a linguistic choice that signaled authority rather than gender. This adaptation extended into court ceremony, where rituals were adjusted to accommodate her singular position. The structures of imperial representation, though ancient, proved capable of modification when guided by necessity. Within Constantinople, the apparatus of governance continued to function with outward stability, sustained by the systems Irene had already brought under her control. Administrative offices operated according to established procedures, while decisions flowed from the palace with consistent authority. The absence of internal opposition allowed her rule to proceed without immediate disruption. Yet beneath this stability lay a question that extended beyond the empire's borders. In the West, the position of the Byzantine throne held significance that reached into the evolving political landscape of Europe. The concept of a Roman emperor, though transformed over centuries, remained central to the legitimacy of rulership across Christian territories. Irene's sole rule, as a woman occupying that position, introduced ambiguity into a system that had long depended on continuity. This ambiguity did not go unnoticed. In the year 800, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned emperor in Rome by Pope Leo III. The ceremony, conducted on the 25th day of December within the Basilica of St. Peter, established a rival claim to imperial authority in the West. The justification, as framed by those involved, rested partly on the argument that the Byzantine throne was effectively vacant, as it was held by a woman. The act formalized a division that had been developing over time. Irene's government responded through diplomatic channels, seeking to navigate the implications of this development without immediate confrontation. Envoys were dispatched, correspondence exchanged, and proposals considered that might reconcile competing claims. Among these was the possibility of a marriage alliance between Irene and Charlemagne, an arrangement that would have unified the two spheres of power. Though discussed, such plans did not come to fruition. Within the empire, Irene continued to exercise authority across both civil and religious domains, maintaining the policies she had established earlier in her rule. The restoration of icons remained in effect, supported by the clergy and reinforced through continued patronage. Churches and monasteries received attention and resources, reflecting her alignment with their interests. This relationship strengthened her position among those who had long opposed iconoclasm. Economic management, however, presented ongoing challenges as the demands of governance required sustained revenue. Irene's administration maintained taxation levels necessary to support the military, the court, and religious institutions. While effective in preserving the functions of the state, these measures placed pressure on segments of the population and the elite. Discontent, though not immediately visible, began to accumulate. The court itself remained a space of careful balance, where loyalty was maintained through both reward and oversight. Irene relied on a network of officials whose positions depended on her continued rule, reinforcing their commitment through consistent support. At the same time, she monitored potential sources of opposition, ensuring that no single faction could gather sufficient strength to challenge her. Control, once established, required constant maintenance. Despite the absence of open rebellion, the uniqueness of her rule continued to shape perceptions both within and beyond the empire. Some viewed her authority as a continuation of established structures, adapted to circumstance. Others saw it as a departure that unsettled expectations, particularly in relation to succession and legitimacy. These differing interpretations influenced how her decisions were received and understood. As the years progressed, the stability of Irene's rule depended increasingly on her ability to manage these underlying tensions. The absence of a clear successor, combined with the evolving political landscape, created conditions that required careful navigation. Each decision carried implications not only for immediate governance, but for the future of the imperial system. The throne, secure in appearance, rested upon a foundation that demanded constant attention. In the great palace, where authority had been consolidated through years of preparation and decisive action, Irene presided alone over an empire that stretched across continents. The corridors that had once echoed with competing voices now carried a singular command. Yet within that unity, the forces that had shaped her rise remained present, waiting for the moment when stability would once again give way to change. By the year 801, the stability that had defined Irene's sole rule began to show visible strain beneath its polished surface. The system she had carefully constructed continued to function, yet the cost of maintaining them grew increasingly difficult to sustain. Revenue demands remained high, driven by the needs of the court, the military, and the religious institutions she supported. Over time, this pressure extended beyond administration into the daily lives of those who sustained the empire's economy. Taxation, long a central tool of imperial governance, became a source of mounting dissatisfaction among both provincial populations and the elite. Landowners, merchants, and local officials felt the cumulative effect of sustained fiscal demands, particularly in regions already affected by external pressures. While the treasury remained active, its stability relied on continuous extraction, leaving little margin for adjustment. The balance between income and support began to tilt toward instability. Within the court, financial strain translated into shifts in loyalty, as the distribution of resources influenced allegiance. Officials who had once benefited from Irene's patronage found their expectations increasingly difficult to meet. The network of support that had secured her rise required constant reinforcement, and as resources tightened, so did the cohesion of that network. Influence, once consolidated, began to fragment under pressure. The military, essential to the empire's security, also reflected these tensions, as funding and confidence intersected. Campaigns along the borders required sustained investment, yet results remained uneven, limiting the perception of strength. Commanders, aware of both financial constraints and political dynamics, began to reassess their positions. Loyalty to the throne, while still present, was no longer unquestioned. At the same time, the broader geopolitical landscape continued to evolve, shaped in part by the rise of Charlemagne in the West. His coronation as emperor in the year 800 introduced a competing center of authority that could not be ignored. Diplomatic engagement with his court required resources and attention, adding another layer of complexity to Irene's rule. The empire, once singular in its claim to Roman legacy, now shared that space with a rival power. Within Constantinople, dissatisfaction did not immediately manifest as open rebellion, but it became increasingly visible in the behavior of key figures. Conversations shifted in tone, alliances recalibrated, and the certainty that had defined Irene's authority began to erode. The absence of a clear successor further complicated the situation, leaving the future of the throne uncertain. In this environment, stability depended as much on perception as on control. Among those observing these developments was Nikephoros, a senior financial official whose position provided both insight and opportunity. As logothete of the Genicon, he oversaw aspects of the empire's fiscal administration, placing him at the center of its economic structure. His experience and connections positioned him as a viable alternative within a court increasingly open to change. Around him, support began to gather with quiet intention. The movement against Irene did not begin with public declaration, but with coordination among those who recognized the shifting balance of power. Officials, military figures, and members of the administrative elite aligned their interests, preparing for a transition that would restore stability as they understood it. The process mirrored earlier shifts within the palace, relying on preparation rather than confrontation. Once again, the mechanisms of power moved without spectacle. In the year 802, the decisive moment arrived with controlled precision. Irene, within the palace she had dominated for years, was confronted not by chaos, but by the orderly execution of a plan. Support within the court had shifted sufficiently to allow for her removal without widespread resistance. The authority she had consolidated now transferred to those prepared to assume it. Nikephoros was proclaimed emperor, his elevation formalized through the same structures that had once affirmed Irene's rule. The transition, though significant, followed established patterns of Byzantine governance, where continuity of form masked the reality of change. Irene, stripped of power, was removed from the center of the empire she had governed. Her reign, defined by both control and rupture, came to an end within the walls that had once secured it. She was exiled first to the island of Principe, and later to Lesbos, locations distant from the political core of Constantinople. The journey marked a reversal of her earlier ascent, moving from the center of authority to its margins. Her life in exile was marked by simplicity, a contrast to the environment she had once commanded. The structures of power, so carefully managed, no longer responded to her presence. In Constantinople, the machinery of empire continued under new leadership, adapting once more to the shift in authority. The palace remained unchanged in its architecture, its halls still lined with marble and gold, yet its occupants and decisions reflected a different order. Irene's fall, like her rise, had been executed through the same system that defined Byzantine rule. The throne endured, even as those who held it were replaced. After her deposition in the year 802, Irene was removed from the structures that had defined her life for decades and sent into exile, first to the island of Principe in the Sea of Marmara. The island, though not distant from Constantinople, existed outside the rhythm of imperial power, its shores lined with monasteries and modest dwellings. There, the former ruler of the Byzantine Empire lived without ceremony, separated from the court that had once revolved around her presence. The transition from palace to isolation marked a shift not only in status, but in the of her existence. Within months, she was transferred again, this time to the island of Lesbos, farther from the capital and further removed from influence. The environment was quieter, defined by agricultural life and limited connection to the political center of the empire. Irene's circumstances were reduced to subsistence, and accounts suggest that she supported herself through manual work, including spinning wool. The image of a former emperor engaged in such labor stood in stark contrast to the authority she had once exercised. Her death came in the year 803, recorded without ceremony, far from the palace where her most decisive actions had taken place. There was no grand procession, no imperial mourning that matched the scale of her reign. Instead, her passing was absorbed into the ongoing continuity of the empire, noted but not allowed to disrupt the order that had replaced her. The system she had navigated so effectively continued without pause. In Constantinople, the reign of Nikephoros established a new phase of governance, one shaped by different priorities and challenges. The financial structures he oversaw as an official now guided his approach as emperor, influencing policy and administration. The court adjusted to his leadership, integrating new alignments while maintaining established forms. The palace, unchanged in its physical structure, adapted once more to a different occupant of its central role. Irene's legacy, however, did not disappear with her removal, but remained embedded in the religious and political transformations she had enacted. The restoration of icons, formalized at the Council of Nicaea, continued to define the spiritual life of the empire. Churches maintained the images that had once been contested, and the visual language of Byzantine Christianity endured. In this, her influence persisted beyond her lifetime, shaping practices that outlasted her rule. Her reign also left a lasting impression on the concept of imperial authority, demonstrating both its flexibility and its limits. By ruling as sole sovereign, she expanded the boundaries of what was possible within the system, even as her fall reaffirmed the constraints imposed by political and economic realities. The precedent of a woman occupying the imperial throne would remain rare, but not forgotten. It existed as a reference point within the broader history of the empire. In the West, her rule and its aftermath contributed to the evolving distinction between Byzantine and Western concepts of empire. The coronation of Charlemagne, framed partly in response to her authority, established a parallel tradition that would develop independently. This division, once formalized, influenced the political landscape of Europe for centuries. Irene's position, therefore, extended beyond her immediate context into a wider historical framework. Within Byzantine chronicles, her actions were recorded with varying interpretations, reflecting the perspectives of those who wrote them. Some accounts emphasized her role in restoring orthodoxy, presenting her as a defender of the faith. Others focused on the blinding of her son, framing it as an act that defined her rule in stark terms. These narratives, preserved in texts and copied across generations, ensured that her story remained part of the empire's memory. The great palace itself, where the most decisive moments of her life unfolded, continued to function as the center of imperial authority. Its halls, lined with marble and gold, bore no visible trace of the events that had taken place within them. Yet the structure carried the accumulated weight of those decisions, embedded in its history even as new rulers occupied its spaces. The continuity of the building mirrored the continuity of the empire. Centuries later, the figure of Irene would remain a subject of reflection, not only for her actions, but for the context in which they occurred. Her rise from provincial nobility to sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire illustrated the possibilities contained within a system defined by both rigidity and adaptability. Her fall, executed through the same mechanisms she had used to gain power, demonstrated the limits of control within that system. Together, these elements formed a narrative that resisted simple interpretation. On the 15th day of August in the year 797, within the enclosed chambers of the Great Palace, a decision was carried out that altered the course of an empire. Years later, on a distant island, the woman who made that decision lived without the symbols of authority that had once defined her. Between those two moments lay a range shaped by calculation, belief, and the structures of power that both enabled and ended it. The empire endured, its continuity marked not by the permanence of rulers, but by the system that replaced them. The city of Constantinople remained, its walls intact, its domes still reflecting the light of the sun across the waters of the Bosphorus. Ships continued to pass between continents, carrying goods, messages, and memory. Within its churches, icons once again watched from their places above the faithful, silent witnesses to the changes that had restored them. And within its history, the name Irene of Athens endured, fixed to a moment when power, faith, and family converged within the walls of an empire.